Hello, welcome to Lecture 3. This week's readings and this week's lecture deal with a broad and quick and brief overview of the criminal justice system. What the criminal justice system is, the steps of the criminal justice process, the three components of the criminal justice system, which are the police, the courts, and corrections, and how we get our crime statistics. So, the purpose of this week's lesson is for those who already have a degree in criminal justice, it should be a refresher for you. A reminder of all these key concepts that you may not have had since you took intro as an undergrad, as a freshman, but just to refresh your mind to make sure we're all on the same sheet of music here. And for those that are taking this course that don't have an undergraduate degree in criminal justice or are not criminal justice majors, it'll seek to bring you up to speed with the basics of the criminal justice process. This is, again, very brief, very quick introduction to the criminal justice system and the criminal justice process. But at least it'll give you somewhat of an understanding of what the rest of the course is going to be discussing. So this is a diagram of the criminal justice process. And we'll go into each one of these blocks in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But realize that it's broken down into three major components. You've got the police, and in this diagram they have prosecution and courts as separate, but prosecution is part of the courts, and then corrections at the end. The police are the front end of the criminal justice system, how people enter the criminal justice system. The courts and prosecution is where people are processed and determined guilt or innocence, and then moved on out of the system. They go to corrections for their punishment if they were found guilty or pled guilty. So, the front part of the criminal justice process. For someone to go through the criminal justice process, first off, a crime has to be reported. Now that it's either reported by a citizen, so you've gotten robbed, and you call the police, and the police come, so you're reporting the crime to them. But it could also be the police officer is reporting the crime. So the police officer sees someone committing a burglary, breaking into a building. The officer, him or herself, is the reporting person. Or, say, for instance, an undercover narcotics officer making a drug buy in a drug sting. Still, that officer is the one reporting the crime. So once a crime is reported, an investigation begins. The investigation may last just a couple minutes, or it may be, for instance, a murder investigation and a whodunit. We don't know who the suspect is. It may take months and years to solve. So there's an investigation, and sometimes that investigation will result in an arrest. If a suspect can be identified and enough evidence is there to substantiate an arrest, the level of evidence would be probable cause. So you have probable cause to make an arrest, and an arrest may occur. It doesn't have to. The police have discretion whether or not to make an arrest. And actually, as you go through this process, the police have discretion at each level. The police have discretion whether or not to take a report. Now, granted, there's political pressure on them. If you've been robbed and you go to the police and you want a report taken, they'll look pretty bad if they don't take a report. However, if you come in and say you were robbed, and you explain to the officer that how you were robbed was, well, I was trying to buy crack, and they took my money, but they didn't give me my crack. Well, the police may not take a report for you. They're not going to take a report in some jurisdictions if you're trying to commit a crime and you lost your money. So they have that discretion whether or not to take a report. And then from that, they have discretion whether or not to investigate. And then, even if there is probable cause, police officers still have discretion whether or not to make an arrest. And there's some good reasons for that. So say, for instance, you've got someone who walks into a convenience store, takes an item off the shelf, and walks out without paying for it. Well, that's theft. However, we find out that that person is mentally disabled and don't know what they're, know the difference between right and wrong. And the person lives in a group home and it walked away from the group home and shouldn't have been out on the street on their own, or a person with Alzheimer's who left a nursing home. So those types of things. it's probably not in the best interest of society for the police to make an arrest. Yes, there's enough probable cause to substantiate an arrest, but it's probably not the best thing for the officers to do. So they do have discretion whether or not to make an arrest. Now, once they make an arrest, if the offender is a juvenile, which is under a certain age, and which varies from state to state, then they will go into the separate juvenile justice system. But if they're an adult, they stay in the adult criminal justice process. And the next step of that is booking. Booking is where they're made an official record of the arrest. So usually they're taken to jail, they're fingerprinted, they're photographed, and they have to usually post some sort of bond to get out of jail before going to trial. After the booking process, the police are no longer involved in this process other than as witnesses. So it moves into the realm of the courts, and primarily the prosecution, but overall the courts are still involved. So the charge goes to the prosecutor. Police officers file charges. They don't press charges, okay? They cannot charge someone. They submit paperwork recommending a charge to the prosecutor. The prosecutor is the only person in the criminal justice system who has the authority to charge someone with a crime. So the prosecutor will review the reports from the police officers and the evidence and determine whether or not he or she is actually going to still charge the person who is arrested. And again, their discretion. Regardless of how much evidence there is, it's their discretion. There may be tons of evidence that the person is guilty of murder. They don't have to charge the person or even have to charge them with murder. And they could let the person go scot-free. Chances are there'd be some major political backlash and they'd lose their job, but they still have that legal discretion. So they decide whether or not to charge. If they don't charge, the person's released from the criminal justice system and is no longer in the process. If they are charged, and they may not be charged with what the officers specifically requested they be charged with, then they go on to an initial appearance. At that initial appearance is where they are formally told what the charges are against them. And I've had students in the past complain, well, I got arrested and the police didn't tell me what I got charged with. Well, one, that's unlikely. Maybe you were too intoxicated to know what you got charged with and they tried to tell you. But even if they didn't, they don't have to. It isn't until the step 5, the initial appearance. Because the police officers are putting in charges, but it's up to the prosecutor to decide what charges will be filed. So the officers may say, I'm arresting you for attempted murder, but you may not be charged with attempted murder. You may be charged with aggravated battery once it gets through the prosecutor. So this happens at the initial appearance, where you're formally told what the charges are against you. Okay? Next is the preliminary hearing. Preliminary hearing, the judge reviews the evidence against you and sees as checks and balances here. The judge determines whether or not there really was enough probable cause for the prosecutor to charge you with that offense. Usually this initial appearance and the preliminary hearing in most jurisdictions where I worked happened at the same time. Okay? And then there's the grand jury, potentially. Prosecutors have the choice, if they don't want to decide whether or not the person should be charged with a crime, they can refer it to a grand jury, which is a pool of individuals selected from the community through jury duty, and they hear the charges against the defendant and determine whether or not there's enough probable cause to charge the person with a crime. They're not determining, a grand jury does not determine guilt or innocence. A grand jury only hears the prosecution's side of the evidence and only is trying to determine whether or not we should charge this person with a crime or not. So if they do find there's enough probable cause to charge them with a crime, they hand down what's called an indictment. That's a written document saying that, yes, we should charge the person with this crime. So the prosecutors can either use an indictment or they can use an information, which is what the police officers fill out, an information document. They have one choice or the other. They can use the grand jury to decide the charge, or they can just decide it themselves and use an information document. Now, sometime after the defendant has been charged with a criminal offense, they go to an arraignment. They may have several appearances in court before this, trying to get an attorney, but at the arraignment, the defendant has to be present with an attorney, defense attorney, to provide them legal counsel. And this is where a plea is entered. They can either enter a plea of guilty. If that's the case, they're pleading guilty, they go straight to the sentencing phase. They forfeited their right to a trial by pleading guilty. They can also plead no contest, which is the same thing as pleading guilty. You'll go straight to the sentencing phase. And way to describe no contest is basically you're saying, I ain't saying I did do it, I ain't saying I didn't do it, but I'll go ahead and take the punishment. The reason for pleading no contest is if there's other charges pending or a civil case that's pending. So say, for instance, you were drunk driving, you crashed your car, killed someone else in the other vehicle, so you're criminally charged with the reckless homicide for killing the person from the drunk driving accident. And then you're also going to be sued for wrongful death by the family of the person that you killed. Well, if you plead no contest, then at the civil trial, they have to prove that you were in fact drunk driving and all the things associated with that. If you had pled guilty, they don't need to prove that. You already pled guilty to all those things in court. So that's the reason for having that option to plead no contest. But it's treated in the system the same as pleading guilty. And then there's pleading not guilty. If you plead not guilty, the case continues on towards trial. And then lastly, there's what's called standing mute. Standing mute is you don't answer. The judge asks you what you're pleading, you refuse to answer, or you answer with anything other than pleading guilty, not guilty, or no contest. So that's if you don't say anything. That's if you tell the judge to go F him or herself, which I've seen in the courtroom. So anything like that would be considered what we call, in the legal terms, stands mute. In that case, we treat it as also pleading not guilty, and it continues on to the trial phase. At trial, it could be a bench trial, which is the judge only determines guilt or innocence, or it can be a jury trial. And we'll talk about, as the course goes on, the different types of trials and the processes related to that. But at trial, the trial determiner of guilt, whether that be a judge or a jury, determines if the defendant is guilty or not guilty. We do not, in the American criminal justice system, find anyone innocent. It could be very likely that the person is still very guilty. We just couldn't prove it in court. So be very clear with that terminology. Person is not found innocent at trial, ever. They're found guilty or not guilty. If they're found not guilty, that's called an acquittal. And then they're out of the criminal justice system. They're done, and they're free to go. If they're found guilty, they also go on to sentencing. So if you've either pled guilty or were found guilty at trial, you go on to sentencing. Sentencing is the punishment that you receive for committing this crime. After that, you have the option for appeal. Most people sentenced to incarceration in prison will try to appeal their convictions, but most people on probation rarely ever try to appeal their cases. And very, very, very few appeals ever actually are successful. And then we move into the corrections portion of the criminal justice system. Corrections is where we carry out the punishments for people convicted or pled guilty of criminal offenses. What type of punishment you get? There are lots of types out there. There's probation, there's jail or prison, which we call incarceration, and there's intermediate sanctions. Intermediate sanctions could be counseling, community service work, all different, anything that doesn't fall under jail or prison or probation. If you go on to prison, there's a possibility you could be released early from prison and still supervised in the community, and that's called parole. So it's different than probation in how you get there, but what you actually do on probation and parole is actually pretty similar. So we'll talk about more of these in further detail in the course. But once you've finally completed your sentence successfully and you've completed all of the requirements of your sentence, then you're released from the criminal justice system. Another aspect of criminal justice in America that's important to understand is illustrated well in this diagram called the wedding cake diagram. It's kind of a way to look at the different types of cases processed in the criminal justice system. The biggest part at the bottom, which is the majority of cases processed in the criminal justice system, are misdemeanors. Okay, shoplifting, drunk driving, public drunkenness, loitering, trespassing, vandalism. That's the vast majority of cases processed by the criminal justice system. If you're working as a law enforcement officer, the vast majority of your arrests are in that misdemeanor level. Minor offenses. And then next up from that, they're less common, so it's a much smaller piece of the cake, are the lesser felonies. That's low-level felonies. So that's burglaries without any aggravating circumstances, felony thefts, so thefts over a certain amount of money. It's different by state statute from state to state how much money has to be stolen before it's a felony. But still those lesser felonies, usually where there's no one harmed, physically, no one was physically threatened, but they're still felony crimes. Drug offenses, the vast majority of drug offenses are these lower level felony cases. So they're the second most common, and they're not nearly as common as the misdemeanor cases. Then next level up from there are the serious felonies. So these are armed robberies, attempted murders, rapes, things like that. Very serious crimes, most of them involving violence. And you see, in comparison to level 3 and level 4, there's very few of them. They're not very common. They're the ones that scare society the most, and then luckily they're the ones that happen the least. And the criminal justice system deals with those the least. And then the very top, the layer 1, the most celebrated cases, these are the ones that get the media attention. These are the ones you see on court TV all the time. These are the ones that make the headlines in the newspaper. These are the ones that scare people the most. And they're usually murders or serious violent crimes involving a child. So when a child is abducted by a child molester, raped and killed, and gets a lot of media attention, that would be that small top level. Or you've got usually some very attractive, usually white woman that's murdered in some heinous way, then that will frequently make it into that top category. So the point of illustrating that is these are the majority of the cases you see on TV, but look at it in comparison to the rest of the diagram. These are unusual cases. They are not the vast majority of cases you deal with in the criminal justice system. The vast majority of cases you're dealing with in the criminal justice system is down there, layer 4. You got the homeless guy who's mentally ill, who's drunk and off his meds, and he shoplifted and was peeing on the side of the building when the police arrested him. That's the majority of types of cases that you're processing in the criminal justice system. And just be aware, what you see covered the most on TV is extremely rare and atypical cases processed by the criminal justice system. Another aspect of criminal justice in America that's important to understand is illustrated well in this diagram called the wedding cake diagram. It's kind of a way to look at the different types of cases processed in the criminal justice system. The biggest part at the bottom, which is the majority of cases processed in the criminal justice system, are misdemeanors. Okay, shoplifting, drunk driving, public drunkenness, loitering, trespassing, vandalism. That's the vast majority of cases processed by the criminal justice system. If you're working as a law enforcement officer, the vast majority of your arrests are in that misdemeanor level. Minor offenses. And then next up from that, they're less common, so it's a much smaller piece of the cake, are the lesser felonies. That's low-level felonies. So that's burglaries without any aggravating circumstances, felony thefts, so thefts over a certain amount of money. It's different by state statute from state to state how much money has to be stolen before it's a felony. But still those lesser felonies, usually where there's no one harmed, Physically, no one was physically threatened, but there's still felony crimes. Drug offenses. The vast majority of drug offenses are these lower level felony cases. So they're the second most common, and they're not nearly as common as the misdemeanor cases. Then next level up from there are the serious felonies. So these are armed robberies, attempted murders, rapes, things like that. Very serious crimes, most of them involving violence. And you see, in comparison to level 3 and level 4, there's very few of them. They're not very common. They're the ones that scare society the most, and then luckily they're the ones that happen the least. And the criminal justice system deals with those the least. And then the very top, the layer 1, the most celebrated cases, these are the ones that get the media attention. These are the ones you see on court TV all the time. These are the ones that make the headlines in the newspaper. These are the ones that scare people the most. And they're usually murders or serious violent crimes involving a child. So when a child is abducted by a child molester, raped, and killed, and gets a lot of media attention, that would be that small top level. Or you've got usually some very attractive, usually white woman that's murdered in some heinous way, then that will frequently make it into that top category. So the point of illustrating that is these are the majority of the cases you see on TV, but look at it in comparison to the rest of the diagram. These are unusual cases. They are not the vast majority of cases you deal with in the criminal justice system. The vast majority of cases you're dealing with in the criminal justice system is down there, layer 4. You got the homeless guy who's mentally ill, who's drunk and off his meds, and he shoplifted and was peeing on the side of the building when the police arrested him. That's the majority of types of cases that you're processing in the criminal justice system. And just be aware, what you see covered the most on TV is extremely rare and atypical cases processed by the criminal justice system. Another important aspect of criminal justice is how much crime is there in the world or in the United States. In the United States and most of the Western world, crime has actually generally declined since the 1980s. We don't have perfect numbers. We'll talk more about that in the next slide here. But from what information we have, crime has been declining since the 1980s. Actually, there was a spike in the early 90s and then it started down again. And currently there's no national crime wave. Crime has been extremely low since the late 1990s. Unfortunately, though, we can't tell you exactly how much crime there is. We don't know for sure how much crime never gets reported to the police. Because with our crime statistics, I mean, for example, a few years back, I had a bicycle stolen. This back when I was working as a police officer and was single. And I went out for a jog and came back, and I had a enclosed porch that was enclosed with screens but no lock on the porch door, and I come back and my bicycle's gone. Well, it was a cheap bike. I bought it from Walmart. I didn't have any paperwork on it anymore. I didn't have the serial number. It was a black mountain bike with green stripes, and that's basically all I could tell you about it. So I didn't call the police because, one, I was the police, and two, even if I did call the police, what am I going to tell them? Yeah, well, I went for a run, bike was there, no, bike's not. Okay, somebody stole it. I don't have any information I can give them on potentially who took it, any suspects. And even if they did catch a kid 2 blocks away riding a bike that looked like that, I didn't have any unique markings on it, and I didn't have a serial number. I couldn't prove that that was my bike. So it wasn't reported to the police. Every single day, crimes occur like that where, what am I going to do? I'm going to call the police? There's nothing they can do about it. So this unreported crime, we don't know how much unreported crime there is, and that's generally referred to as the dark figure of crime, a metaphor emphasizing the dimension of crime that's never reported to the police. So we can never be sure exactly how much crime there actually is out there. However, with that said, we can track crime trends. We may not know exactly how much total crime there is, but the way we track crime, we can tell if it's increasing or decreasing. Because we track it the same way every year, we know if we keep tracking it the same way and get the same types of crimes, we can track the numbers of those crimes that we're getting. And the ways we get this is through a number of sources of crime statistics. The three most important I've listed here. One is FBI Uniform Crime Reports. Starting in the 1960s, the FBI started a program where they had all police departments in the country. It's voluntary, but most of them cooperate with it. When they make arrests for a certain categories of major crimes, they report those statistics to the police when those crimes are reported and whether or not an arrest was made. And all that data from all those police departments eventually end up at the FBI, and they compile a report every year of how much crime, based on only those categories, was recorded in the United States. So we can determine whether or not crime is increasing or decreasing. Uniform crime reports, though, don't give you much detail. For instance, the category of robbery. Okay, there's robbery. We can tell you the city of Toledo, how many robberies they handled and how many of those robberies resulted in an arrest. And that's it. Well, what types of robberies? Are the robberies increasing with convenience stores or these home invasions? Well, what's going on? We don't know from Uniform Crime Reports because it doesn't collect that level of detail. So in the 1990s, the Uniform Crime Report started a separate program called the National Incident-Based Reporting Service, or NIBRS for short. What NIBRS does, and it's far less participation in this, probably only about 20% of police departments in the country participate in NIBRS, but with NIBRS, there's a whole bunch of more information that we fill out. When I was on the Indiana State Police started participating in NIBRS in about 1993. And this is the days before a lot of computer usage, so we were still doing most of our forms by hand or by typewriter. And boy, we wanted to kill whoever came up with the idea for NIBRS, because in addition to doing a report for, say for instance, a burglary report, and I've got a 2-3 page burglary report, then I have to fill out this stupid NIBRS form. That's a Scantron form that's 4 or 5 pages long of filling in all the little bubbles with all this additional information. The relationship of victim to offender, the time of day, the location, the geographic location. Was it a house? Was it an apartment? What was the motive? All this stuff. So from the officer's perspective, this is a major pain in the neck. But from the researcher perspective, it gives us a lot more detail into what crime patterns are happening. Well, these are crimes reported to the police. That's how you get this information through Uniform Crime Reports. You had to call the police. What about the crimes that were never reported to the police? Well, that can be measured through what's called the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS. This is a huge nationwide survey conducted every 6 months for years and years now, where households are contacted and an adult from the household is picked and asked a bunch of questions about the crimes that they may have been a victim of in the last 6 months. Again, they still might not be reporting everything. You know, when a stranger's knocking on your door asking questions if you've been raped in the last year, you're probably not going to tell that stranger that happened. And people may have made up stuff as well as they're telling them, especially lonely people who want to keep that researcher at their door as someone to talk to. But with all those weaknesses taken into consideration, it still gives us a better picture of crime than what we get from the Uniform Crime Reports, because we're getting crimes that were not reported to the police. And then the Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring Program. This measures drug and alcohol use among people who are arrested. There's a number of jails across the country who participate in this, and it's a questionnaire that everyone being booked into jail is asked a series of questions regarding their past and current drug use, and they're given a drug test the pee in the cup when they come into jail to determine what was in their system when they arrived. Now, let's talk about our readings for this week, which is going to cover this stuff in a little bit more detail. All of our readings this week come from a book written by Chris Eskridge. Chris Eskridge is a scholar I like. He's a professor at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. Prior to becoming a criminal justice professor, he worked as a sheriff's deputy in Utah, I believe, for a few years. He's also been very active within our academic discipline. We have two professional associations within criminal justice. One is the American Society of Criminology, or ASC, and the other is the Academy of Criminal Justice Science, and that's ACJS. And Chris Eskridge has been the president alternately of both of them. So he's a very well-liked guy, and I think a pretty good writer and researcher. So, of Chris Eskridge's work, we're going to read several very short sections from books that he wrote. And the first section is Crime and Justice in America. This is an overview of the crime reporting process and crime trends and what the different crime categories are, and it'll talk about Uniform Crime Reports and ADAM and the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, NIBRS. It'll talk about all those things in a little bit more detail and give you a better understanding of where we get our crime statistics and what are the current crime trends in the United States. The next section, Eskridge covers here justice and the American Justice Network. Talks about the three components of the criminal justice system: the police, the courts, the corrections, and how they interact. And it goes into detail of the criminal justice process that I already briefly went through, from reporting of the crime through release on the outside of the other end of the criminal justice system. Then we've got a section that's a brief overview of American law enforcement. So the first component of the criminal justice system, law enforcement, the police, give you just a very quick overview of that component, that part of the criminal justice system. Next is another brief section, this time on the courts, the second component of the criminal justice system, the organization of the courts, how they operate, what level of government they are, things like that. And then the last reading is a small section on the American corrections system. So prisons, jail, probation, intermediate sanctions, death penalty, all those things. But just a brief overview to have an understanding of all three components of the criminal justice system.